Hey guys, tonight we slipped past the velvet ropes of 1912 and walked straight into the floating fantasy land that was Titanic's first class, where the carpets were thicker than your winter blankets, and the egos were, frankly, thicker. Imagine chandeliers trembling gently with the hum of engines, silverware clinking like it had generational wealth, and silk gowns whispering across marble floors while the Atlantic rolled outside, dark and unbothered. This wasn't just a boat ride, it was a flex. A 7-day Instagram story before Instagram existed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me your location and the local time where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In April 1912, first class aboard the RMS Titanic had been less a passenger category and more a curated exhibition of human wealth, arranged carefully across polished decks and beneath ceilings carved in ornate plaster. The ship itself, built by the White Star Line, had been marketed as the pinnacle of Edwardian luxury, and first class served as its crown jewel, the showroom in which modern engineering and old money shook hands like smug cousins at a wedding. Passengers who purchased the most expensive tickets did not merely expect transportation from Southampton to New York. They expected insulation from ordinary existence. They brought trunks the size of small apartments, containing gowns, dinner jackets, gloves for every conceivable social scenario, and hats that required their own emotional support. A first-class ticket could cost more than many workers earned in years, which meant that stepping onto that promenade deck had been, quite literally, an economic mic drop. The clientele included industrial magnates, American heiresses, British aristocrats, and the sort of people whose business cards practically exhaled privilege. Among them had been figures like John Jacob Astor IV, whose fortune floated comfortably above the anxieties of the age, and Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to mining wealth that had clawed its way out of mountains only to settle into silk-lined cabins. They inhabited staterooms modeled after French chateaux and Italian palaces, because sleeping plainly was apparently not an option. The decor had been executed in revivalist styles, Louis XV here, Georgian there, each corridor performing a historical cosplay of European grandeur. Yet beneath the glittering veneer ran the steady pulse of coal-fired engines and the labor of hundreds of crew members whose quarters bore no resemblance to Versailles. First class had functioned as a kind of floating illusion, a carefully staged environment where the Atlantic felt less like a threat and more like a decorative backdrop. Even the air seemed curated, scented faintly with cigars, perfume, and ambition. It was, in essence, a microcosm of the Edwardian world, hierarchical, extravagant, and supremely confident in its own permanence. And as the great liner eased away from the dock, trailing cheers and handkerchiefs in the spring light, first class had glided forward, wrapped in the comfortable assumption that comfort itself was unsinkable. That assumption, of course, would prove to be the most expensive accessory on board. The physical spaces reserved for first class had been designed not merely to impress, but to gently remind everyone exactly where they stood in the global pecking order. The grand staircase rose through the decks like a theatrical centerpiece, crowned by a glass dome that filtered sunlight into something almost holy, as if wealth itself required divine lighting. Carved oak panels curled along the walls, each swirl and flourish announcing that subtlety had not been invited. At its center stood the clock featuring allegorical figures of honor and glory crowning time, which felt less decorative and more like a smug prophecy. Passengers descended those steps in the evenings dressed for dinner, jewels catching the light, shoes clicking in controlled rhythm, every entrance choreographed whether they admitted it or not. The reception room opened outward in soft creams and gilded trims, leading toward the dining saloon, which could seat over 500 guests beneath glittering chandeliers. It was less a restaurant and more a statement. Yes, they could feed 500 elites simultaneously, and yes, it would involve multiple forks. The Turkish bath complex offered steam rooms, cooling rooms, and a swimming pool tiled in white and blue, because apparently even crossing the Atlantic required spa options. There had been a gymnasium fitted with electric camels and mechanical horses, devices that looked like Victorian fever dreams, but were marketed as cutting-edge exercise. Meanwhile, just beyond polished corridors, stewards moved quietly, adjusting coal fires and fireplaces and replenishing fresh flowers before they dared wilt. Every surface had been curated to signal permanence. Thick carpets, muffled footsteps, heavy doors sealed out drafts, and wide promenade decks invited leisurely strolls, shielded from sea spray by glass screens. It all functioned as a floating country house, detached from the industrial grime that powered it. The irony hovered invisibly in the engine vibrations beneath their feet, but few paused to contemplate the laboring stokers shoveling coal below. Instead, first-class passengers reclined in wicker chairs, wrapped in blankets, discussing stock markets and marriage alliances as if the Atlantic were simply a cooperative stagehand. The illusion held because it was designed to hold. Architecture became reassurance. Decoration became doctrine. If walls were this solid, if chandeliers shone this brightly, then surely the ship itself embodied the same invincibility. The environment whispered constantly that catastrophe was unfashionable, and first class had always trusted good taste over bad omens. Meals in first class had unfolded like edible theater, each course arriving with the quiet confidence of something that knew it would be admired before it was tasted. The dining saloon had glowed beneath chandeliers while waiters in crisp jackets navigated between tables, carrying silver platters heavy with oysters, consommé, salmon, filet mignon, roast squab, and desserts so elaborate they looked mildly competitive. On the evening of April 14th, the final dinner menu read like a culinary victory lap. Multiple wines, rich sauces, and a parade of courses that required strategic pacing unless one wished to surrender halfway through. It was not simply nourishment, it was performance. Diners had adjusted gloves, exchanged gossip, and evaluated one another's table manners with the subtlety of a fencing match. Across the room sat figures such as Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida, whose quiet devotion to each other would later eclipse every polished detail of the table setting. At another gathering, John Jacob Astorfulfer entertained companions with stories that drifted somewhere between polite anecdote and understated brag, because when one possessed that much money, understatement became its own sport. The clink of crystal and the murmur of conversation blended into a soundtrack of cultivated assurance. Even the printed menus, embossed and carefully typeset, functioned as souvenirs of excess. Meanwhile, somewhere far below, stokers sweated in furnace heat to maintain the electricity powering these glowing chandeliers. The contrast had been almost theatrical in its imbalance, yet few diners lingered on that reality. Their world extended as far as the next course, and no further. After dinner, many migrated to the smoking room, an oak-paneled enclave thick with cigar smoke and heavier opinions. There, leather chairs absorbed the weight of men debating finance and politics, as though the ocean itself awaited their verdict. Brandy circulated, and card games unfolded with stakes that would have funded entire households elsewhere. In the adjoining lounge, women gathered amid floral arrangements and soft upholstery, discussing Paris fashions and upcoming social seasons. The segregation of spaces reflected Edwardian norms with the confidence of habit. No one needed to explain it. It simply was. Food, drink, and conversation reinforced a hierarchy so normalized it felt atmospheric. As the final desserts were cleared away that Sunday night, the room had hummed with satisfaction, unaware that history was already repositioning the chairs. Beyond the dining saloon and smoking room, first class had operated on a schedule that felt suspiciously like a country estate pretending to float. Mornings began gently, with stewards delivering tea and biscuits to staterooms dressed in damask and optimism. Sunlight filtered through portholes and larger promenade windows, landing delicately on embroidered cushions as if even daylight had been instructed to behave. Passengers emerged in tailored morning attire, newspapers in hand, ready to consume global headlines while physically suspended between continents. There had been something almost comedic about reading about labor strikes and political unrest while reclining in a wicker-deck chair under a plaid blanket, the Atlantic stretching obediently in every direction. One could almost hear the ocean sighing at the irony. The promenade deck became a runway of restrained pageantry. Women in layered dresses and extravagant hats paced slowly for fresh air, while men discussed business prospects with the casual tone of those who had never truly feared bankruptcy. Occasionally, a steward adjusted a blanket or repositioned a chair, performing service so discreet it bordered on invisible. Nearby, the ship's orchestra rehearsed light selections, their violins threading melody through salt-tinged air. It all projected serenity, curated and maintained with near-military precision. Some passengers explored the library, its shelves lined with polished wood and quiet ambition, while others experimented with the gymnasium's mechanical contraptions that promised fitness through polite oscillation. The electric horse in particular had been an object of fascination, wobbling riders in dignified absurdity. One suspected it had been designed by someone who had never actually seen a horse move. Yet no one laughed too loudly. Decorum clung stubbornly to the air. Even leisure required elegance. Afternoons drifted toward tea service, where porcelain cups met saucers in gentle percussion and pastries appeared in tiers. Conversations turned toward arrival plans in New York, upcoming social calls, and the subtle calculus of who would host whom first. It was a floating prelude to American high society, a rehearsal dinner for status. Beneath their polished routines, the engines pulsed steadily, translating coal into motion, motion into distance, distance into anticipation. The sea remained calm, almost unnervingly so, its surface reflecting sky in a way that suggested endless stability. And so, first class continued its ritual choreography, unaware that the stillness outside had begun to sharpen into something far less decorative. As afternoon softened toward evening on April 14th, the temperature had dipped with a subtlety that only the crew truly registered. First-class passengers noticed it merely as a reason to request thicker wraps on the promenade, perhaps to comment that the air felt bracing, which was Edwardian code for mildly inconvenient. The sea lay unusually calm, a sheet of darkening glass stretching outward without interruption. Seasoned sailors later remarked that such stillness could be ominous, since waves often broke against icebergs and made them easier to detect. But in first class, omens were not fashionable accessories. The wireless room crackled periodically with iceberg warnings from other ships, including the Californian and the Carpathia, messages that filtered upward through command channels yet failed to disturb the porcelain tranquility of dinner service. Captain Edward Smith, a veteran nearing retirement, moved through the dining saloon that evening with measured composure, greeting passengers as though presiding over a particularly elegant garden party. His calm demeanor reassured them. Authority wore a pleasant face, and that was enough. After dinner concluded and conversations drifted toward card tables and brandy glasses, the ship pressed forward at near full speed. The logic behind this pace was rooted in confidence, confidence in engineering, in watertight compartments, in the modernity that had promised to master nature. The Titanic had been equipped with 16 such compartments, separated by bulkheads that designers believed would render her practically unsinkable. Practically was doing heavy lifting in that sentence, but marketing had preferred bold adjectives. Up on deck, the night sharpened into crystalline cold. Stars scattered across the sky with almost aggressive clarity, unblurred by moonlight. The Atlantic appeared infinite and indifferent, its surface reflecting starlight in fractured glimmers. Somewhere ahead, an iceberg drifted southward, a relic of ancient glaciers minding its own business. It neither knew nor cared about dining etiquette. Shortly before 11:40 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee strained their eyes from the crow's nest, lacking binoculars that had been misplaced due to a staffing shuffle before departure. When Fleet finally spotted the pale outline directly ahead, he rang the warning bell and telephoned the bridge. The order to turn hard as starboard was issued, engines reversed, steel responding with the reluctant grace of something too large to pivot quickly. Down below, a faint shudder rippled through first class, subtle, almost polite. Some passengers paused mid-conversation, brows lifting slightly. It felt less like catastrophe and more like an awkward handshake with the sea. And so the evening's polished rhythm faltered, ever so slightly, as reality cleared its throat. The sensation had been so understated that several first-class passengers initially treated it as a minor inconvenience, the sort of mechanical hiccup one mentioned briefly before returning to cards. Glasses trembled, a few ice cubes clinked with unnecessary drama, and somewhere a gentleman steadied his brandy as though personally offended. The engine slowed, then stopped, and the silence that followed felt stranger than the vibration had. People noticed quiet the way one noticed a missing note in familiar music. Some drifted toward the promenade to investigate, their breath fogging faintly in the frigid air. There, fragments of ice lay scattered like crushed crystal along the deck, kicked experimentally by polished shoes. It was almost whimsical, like the ocean had sent over party favors. A few even laughed. If the Atlantic had meant to terrify, it needed better timing. Inside, stewards reassured guests that there was no cause for alarm. The phrase traveled through corridors with suspicious efficiency. No cause for alarm. History's favorite red flag. Captain Smith, informed of the damage, understood far more than he allowed to show. The iceberg had sliced along the starboard hull, opening multiple compartments to the sea. The ship could survive with 4 flooded. More than that, and buoyancy transformed into mathematics with a cruel personality. Naval architect Thomas Andrews conducted inspections below deck, moving through tilted mail rooms and flooding boiler rooms, his expression tightening with each calculation. When he returned to the upper decks, he spoke quietly with the captain, delivering the verdict that the Titanic would sink. It was not dramatic. It was clinical. Time, once decorative on the grand staircase clock, had suddenly acquired teeth. Yet in first class, information arrived diluted. Passengers were advised to put on life jackets as a precaution. Precaution sounded civilized, almost optional. Women adjusted corsets over bulky cork vests, mildly irritated at the aesthetic disruption. Some refused initially, convinced that stepping into lifeboats would expose them to unnecessary cold. The ship, after all, glowed warmly behind them, electric lights steady, carpets dry. It did not resemble something dying. Crew members began uncovering lifeboats, their davits creaking as they were swung outward. The capacity issue, lifeboats for roughly half on board, had been justified earlier as compliance with outdated maritime regulations. In that moment, the arithmetic felt less theoretical. Still, many first-class passengers lingered in lounges, waiting for clearer instruction, confident that priority and proximity would insulate them. Privilege had functioned flawlessly up to this point. Why would it glitch now? The sea, meanwhile, continued entering the hull with quiet determination, indifferent to social rank and utterly unimpressed by chandeliers. As realization began spreading, slowly, stubbornly, first class shifted from mild annoyance to brittle composure. Stewards knocked on doors with firmer insistence now, repeating instructions that no longer sounded decorative. Women and children were to proceed to the boat deck. The phrase carried the weight of maritime protocol, yet within it lay the beginning of separation. Husbands helped wives into life belts, fingers fumbling at unfamiliar straps, expressions attempting bravery with varying success. Some men adopted a tone of gallant reassurance, promising to follow on the next boat as though reserving theater seats. Others masked fear with dry humor that did not quite land. On deck, the cold bit sharply, slicing through evening gowns and tailored coats without apology. The lifeboats hung overhead, smaller than anyone preferred to acknowledge. When the first was lowered at 12:45 a.m., it departed half full. The reluctance had been astonishing. Passengers hesitated to step into what looked like fragile wooden shells suspended over black water. From the illuminated deck, the ocean appeared like a bottomless ink spill. Choosing the lifeboat required admitting the ship might fail. Many were not emotionally prepared to update that belief system. Crew members urged them on, voices tightening. A few prominent figures complied quickly. Madeline Astor, newly married and pregnant, was guided carefully into a boat, while her husband remained behind, bound by policy and expectation. He reportedly asked if he might accompany her. The answer was no. He stepped back with controlled resignation, the kind that history later framed as noble. Nearby, Benjamin Guggenheim returned to his cabin to change into evening wear after initially donning a life belt, declaring he preferred to go down dressed as a gentleman. It was either dignity or denial, wearing a tuxedo, perhaps both. Isidore and Ida Strauss faced their own crossroads. Offered a seat in a lifeboat due to his status, Isidore declined while other men waited. Ida refused to leave him, choosing instead to remain at his side. Their decision cut through the surrounding noise with startling clarity. Around them, deck chairs were rearranged, ropes creaked, and officers attempted to enforce order without triggering panic. Class still exerted influence. First-class passengers were physically closer to the boats, and their evacuation proceeded earlier than that of steerage below. Yet proximity did not guarantee survival. Confusion, disbelief, and the sheer logistics of lowering boats in darkness complicated everything. The orchestra assembled on deck, instruments trembling slightly in chilled hands, and began to play. Music drifted into the night air, strangely soothing, as if melody could negotiate with physics. First class, once curated for comfort, had become a stage where composure battled inevitability under a sky brutally clear. The orchestra's strains, waltzes, ragtime, something that sounded faintly like optimism, wove through the freezing air, carrying a surreal soundtrack for first-class passengers teetering between disbelief and compliance. Some clutched life belts like fragile shields, still adjusting gloves over cork padding, whispering reassurances they didn't fully believe. Others attempted conversation, as if discussing stock portfolios might somehow stabilize the Atlantic's temperament. Officers moved along the rails, directing lifeboat loading with brisk efficiency, yet every decision carried a subtle calculus. Who could fit? Who would board first? Who might hesitate just long enough to matter? Stewards guided women and children into boats with polite firmness, gently nudging the hesitant while muttering phrases that history would remember only in fragments. Outside, the sea reflected moonlight in fractured patterns, each ripple a reminder that the supposedly invincible liner now negotiated gravity, water, and time with less certainty than advertised. From the promenade deck, passengers observed the lowering boats with mixed fascination and horror, some silently criticizing the craftsmanship of the wooden hulls as if that mattered. A few gentlemen engaged in thinly veiled debates about whether the vessel could truly sink, measuring courage against disbelief. Others, aware of the imbalance between lifeboats and passengers, shared quiet jokes that were less humorous than defiant, a coping mechanism of the absurdly privileged. Below deck, the first-class cabins began to feel eerily vacant, as owners of silk and mahogany had departed, leaving the walls and rugs to hold ghosts of comfort. Even the grand staircase, usually a triumphant symbol of Edwardian elegance, tilted slightly under the ship's angle, its crystal banisters catching flickers of lamplight in distorted reflections. Music persisted, creating an uncanny calm that hung in the cold, salty air. The transition from ritualized leisure to survival theater happened almost imperceptibly, though each step carried enormous consequence. Every carefully maintained social order, every polished deck and chandelier now existed alongside a creeping reality. Privilege could influence boarding order, but it could not bend physics. Those remaining debated who would stay together, who would abandon protocol for instinct, who might find courage or folly in that choice. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, seemed to mock the meticulousness of human planning while simultaneously framing every gesture, conversation, hesitation, embrace, or silent gaze as acutely poignant. Even as lifeboats rowed outward, carrying carefully chosen groups, first-class passengers continued to negotiate a world in which expectation and fear collided, clinging to ritual where possible and improvising when necessary. And somewhere, within the layered, fur-lined coats and evening wear, the first hints of understanding rippled. The ship, for all its opulence, was no longer a guarantee. By now, water had begun infiltrating lower first-class areas, cold seeping along carpets and upholstery with patient insistence, carrying a scent that combined salt, varnish, and a faint note of panic. Passengers on the upper decks still clung to the illusion of control, adjusting scarves and gloves, murmuring about the briskness of the wind, as if commenting on temperature could stave off physics. Some men carried small suitcases, either out of reflex or stubborn attachment, moving toward lifeboats with an air of practiced dignity. A handful of women clutched handbags, gloves, and embroidery, prioritizing belongings over basic survival tools, proving that habit dies hard even when the Atlantic is involved. The crew attempted to manage the lifeboat loading with surgical patience, lowering each vessel carefully while arguing quietly among themselves over weight distribution and the ethics of leaving spots empty to avoid capsizing. Officers used megaphones sparingly, understanding that clear authority mattered even when panic threatened, but commands often collided with social expectation. First-class passengers expected polite attention and minimal disruption, and tension threaded between those demands and the cold logic of survival. As the angle of the ship increased ever so slightly, corridors that had once hosted leisurely strolls became slippery and disorienting, carpets dampening footsteps, yet failing to mask the water creeping across thresholds. In the smoking room, a few remaining gentlemen lit cigars with fingers numb from cold, their calm facades cracking only in the occasional tremble of ash. On the grand staircase, crystal chandeliers tilted as gravity shifted, casting refracted lights across faces frozen in disbelief. The orchestra, still valiantly performing, had moved to the boat deck, playing pieces chosen more for morale than melody. Music became a bridge between worlds, between order and chaos, between expectation and reality. Outside, lifeboats cut across the inky water, rowers fighting currents, while passengers whispered reassurances to one another that had little grounding in fact. The contrast between the curated first-class life and the raw unpredictability of the Atlantic could not have been starker. Privilege allowed a head start, better clothing, and access to life-saving equipment, but even silk gloves and tailored coats could not change cold, gravity, or the slowly shifting mass of a stricken ship. In staterooms that remained partially dry, personal effects floated or lay abandoned, small emblems of a world about to vanish. The realization that Titanic's grandeur was transient began filtering subtly through the ranks, tempered by denial, stoicism, and the occasional sarcastic internal commentary, somewhere between, well, this is inconvenient, and so this is how it ends, huh? Even in the final hours, first class had attempted to preserve dignity, proving that human vanity is remarkably resilient, even when faced with the Atlantic's apathy. By the early hours of April 15th, first class had shifted from polite coordination to tense improvisation, the air thick with damp wool, perfume, and mounting anxiety. Officers shouted instructions over the wind, and crew members strained to lower the final lifeboats while attempting to maintain calm among passengers still negotiating social norms. Some women refused to board without male companions, while some men argued about the fairness of prioritizing children over themselves, or worse, calculating who truly deserved a spot based on lineage or wealth. Beneath them, water had breached more compartments, pressing against bulkheads and sending faint shudders through decks that had once reverberated with conversation and laughter. Stewards moved mechanically, guiding and cajoling, faces set in masks of controlled panic that only partially concealed fear. The remaining first-class cabins had transformed into staging areas for survival rather than comfort. With personal belongings shoved aside, steamer trunks acting as barricades or footrests, and clothing piled haphazardly on chairs for warmth. On deck, the wind howled, whipping gowns and coats into chaotic flutters that made high society look absurdly theatrical, which it always had, but now more so. The orchestra played on, their music straining against the natural soundtrack of screaming, cracking wood, and rushing water. Some passengers clung to its rhythm as though it could negotiate a truce with the sea. Madeline Astor had been safely evacuated, while her husband lingered on deck, exchanging few words with officers, face pale but composed. Dignity persisted, or perhaps it was stubborn disbelief. Other couples were less fortunate, torn between protocol, devotion, and panic. The lifeboats filled unevenly, with some leaving under capacity because of fear of tipping, while others brimmed dangerously, a logistical mess no etiquette could fully smooth over. First-class passengers maintained a fragile hierarchy even here. Wealth and social standing granted proximity, access, and priority, but not immunity. The gap between expectation and reality widened perceptibly with every passing minute, the Titanic's angle increasing, hull creaking, lights flickering slightly under electrical strain. Officers attempted to coordinate remaining survivors, shouting instructions that collided with etiquette, disbelief, and freezing temperatures. In corners, Individuals clutched handbags, journals, letters, even gloves, performing a curious dance between preservation of life and preservation of identity. The sea loomed closer with each second, indifferent to finery, lineage, or composure. First class had been curated to display human excellence, to separate comfort from consequence, to impress and control. Now it was a gallery of survival instincts, denial, and stubborn vanity, all interacting with forces that could not be negotiated. The final lifeboats, still lowered in fits of hesitancy and urgency, became lifelines not just for bodies, but for ego, for identity, for the illusion that status could influence fate. As the boat dipped deeper into the Atlantic, first-class passengers remaining on deck faced the stark reality that no number of silver forks, silk gowns, or gilded staircases could alter physics. Officers attempted to organize the remaining survivors, but panic, cold, and disbelief collided in ways that rendered authority partially impotent. Water sloshed across decks, soaking shoes and skirts, while the wind shrieked through rigging, tugging at coats and scarves like it had personal grudges. Some passengers embraced one another, fingers numb, expressions tight with fear, while others remained rigid, as if posture could somehow negotiate survival. Gentlemen offered arms, hats clutched like talismans, while women clung to one another or to strangers, murmuring prayers or defiant commentary that history could only infer. The ship's angle worsened rapidly, gravity no longer a polite suggestion, and lifeboats already lowered swayed dangerously with waves that had grown indifferent to human calculation. The orchestra continued, producing an eerie soundtrack that contrasted violently with the chaos. Melodies were torn from order into absurdity by the groaning steel and shouts of crew attempting coordination. A few first-class men helped neighbors into lifebelts, realizing too late that these buoyant vests were more symbolic than comforting. Personal effects were abandoned entirely. Jewelry, gloves, and hats tumbled into the sea, floating briefly before vanishing into ink-colored waters. The ocean's temperature, unforgiving and immediate, forced prioritization of life over decorum. Yet even here, small rituals of etiquette persisted. Some tried to maintain lines, some insisted on assisting women and children first, some cracked dry, ironic jokes in a desperate attempt to impose narrative structure on a collapsing reality. The sheer volume of human decision-making under duress produced a peculiar choreography. Fear and training, privilege and improvisation, habit and instinct collided. Even as the stern rose, threatening to pitch more passengers into the frigid Atlantic, first-class identity lingered stubbornly. Some straightened collars, adjusted coats, or smoothed hair in the brief moments before water closed around them. Officers and crew shouted final instructions, but the scale of disaster had surpassed the capacity of voices alone. Beneath it all, the ship's engines groaned a metallic lament, steel bending and twisting under stresses unseen yet deeply felt. The Atlantic, dark and infinite, continued its patient negotiation, accepting no excuses, no privilege, no politeness. Those who clung to one another, to ritual or to hope, discovered the limits of human preparation, and while lifeboats drifted outward with small clusters of survivors, those left behind on the upper decks were forced into a stark confrontation with mortality, elegance reduced to instinct, and curated identity drowned in salt and cold. In these final hours, the illusion of invincibility had dissolved, leaving only raw humanity, fear, stubbornness, and fleeting acts of courage under the indifferent gaze of the night sky. As the Titanic's stern began to rise higher, water rushing into the aft compartments like it had been rehearsing for centuries, first-class passengers clung to railings, each other, or thin shreds of composure, aware that decorum was no longer negotiable. The chill of the Atlantic pierced layers of cashmere, wool, and silk, reducing any pretense of insulation to a cruel joke. Officers shouted instructions that were drowned by wind and panic, while crew members struggled to launch remaining lifeboats, some tipping precariously, others stuck at impossible angles, proving that elegance and physics had never been compatible. A few passengers tried to assist strangers into the boats, improvising social rules in real time, negotiating hierarchy and humanity with fingers stiff from cold, eyes wide with disbelief. The water reached upper decks, lapping at polished shoes, skirts, and trousers, turning promenade walks into shallow rivers and erasing the line between leisure and survival. Amid the chaos, the orchestra played its final, haunting notes, bows scraping strings with desperate precision, music floating over screaming, splashing, and the grinding steel of the ship bending beneath stress it had never been designed to endure. Some first-class passengers offered arms to neighbors, whispered instructions, or comforted those nearest, creating microcosms of civility in the midst of entropy. Others, stubborn or frozen by shock, maintained posture, holding gloves, hats, or jewelry, as if preserving identity could alter fate. From above, stars shone cold and indifferent, reflecting in black waters that had swallowed centuries of ice before, and would swallow more after, as if history itself waited quietly for the final act. The ship's lights flickered once, twice, then gave way to the darkness that would envelope the Atlantic. With a final grinding shift, the Titanic split, water roaring into newly exposed sections, pulling those still clinging to the upper decks into the void. Lifeboats, adrift and partially filled, bobbed as survivors shouted, comforted one another, and stared back at the impossibly vast emptiness that had claimed the rest. First-class identity, once meticulously curated in gold-trimmed staircases, oak-paneled lounges, and silk-lined cabins, dissolved entirely into human fragility and instinct. In those final moments, wealth, status, and expectation meant nothing against the fundamental impartiality of the sea, leaving only memory, courage, panic, and the faint echo of violin strings fading into cold, indifferent water. The Atlantic, infinite and merciless, reclaimed the grandeur, ambition, and vanity that had floated atop it, carrying them into history. Whispers of a floating palace now submerged, leaving behind an enduring testament to the collision of human hubris and nature's indifference. And so, the narrative of Titanic's first class, curated for comfort, control, and prestige, ended not with ceremony, but with the simple, unflinching verdict of physics. No chair, no chandelier, no tailored coat, no money could alter the ocean's impartiality. In the late 14th century, King Rudolph of a rather small but surprisingly dramatic European principality had a habit of vanishing during his own coronation week, which, honestly, set a high bar for awkward political theater. One morning, attendants entered his bedroom to find the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn, and Rudolph gone, leaving only a half-eaten pear and a suspiciously warm chamber pot that no one dared touch. The servants whispered, of course, and the court astrologer insisted it was a celestial alignment issue, while the chief knight muttered something about cursed architecture, which seemed a bit dramatic, but, in hindsight, not totally wrong. The palace itself was a confusing maze of corridors, spiral staircases, and emergency exits that only existed on paper, because anyone who tried to locate them ended up in the wine cellar or a broom closet. Stories circulated of Rudolph wandering in his own castle for days, only glimpsed by shadows behind velvet drapes, apparently experimenting with a new kind of hide-and-seek or testing the loyalty of anyone who remembered to feed him. Letters sent to neighboring courts explained his absence with vague phrases like pursuing matters of state or deep meditation, which basically translates to he is lost somewhere between the North Tower and the dungeon that smells like old shoes. Some historians suggest that Rudolph, tired of protocol, intentionally disappeared to see if anyone noticed, which is peak monarch energy and honestly relatable. But others argue the castle had some architectural voodoo going on, sloping floors, hidden panels, and a spiral staircase designed to make even the most seasoned guard question their life choices. One particular day, the Queen's maid reportedly saw him leaning out of a second-floor window, reading a letter upside down, and then simply vanished into a wall that, to everyone else, was solid stone. Rumors swirled that secret tunnels had been built during an earlier reign for smuggling wine, messages, or possibly disgraced relatives, and Rudolph had discovered them like a kid in a grown-up's treasure hunt. Visitors left the court with stories of a king who materialized only when the candles flickered a certain way, appearing in one corridor only to vanish in the next, leaving footprints in dust that led nowhere. Modern architects, if you ask them politely, might call it bad planning, but medieval courtiers swore it was a sign of divine mystery, or at least very committed method acting. Meanwhile, the neighboring dukes used Rudolph's absences to rearrange alliances, host mini-feasts, and generally act like life was normal, which it wasn't, because the king of the castle that ate people, or at least ate attention, had decided the best way to rule was by ghosting everyone in his own home. No one ever found out where he went during those vanished hours, and historians now describe the events with a mix of awe and subtle eye-rolling, because it's one thing to read about diplomacy, and another to imagine a grown man getting lost in a room he technically owns. People still wonder if Rudolph invented the first medieval escape room, or if the castle itself simply decided it didn't like him that week. Either way, the king's disappearances became legendary, documented in letters, tavern songs, and at least one slightly exaggerated tapestry featuring him fading into the wall, pear in hand. The absurdity of a ruler getting lost inside his own palace is somehow comforting, like proof that even kings can totally mismanage their real estate. In London, during the late 15th century, two young princes, Edward and Richard, were officially under house arrest in the Tower, which sounds cozy until you realize house arrest in a castle basically means permanent vanishing without Wi-Fi. No one really knows what happened, though every historian has their own hot take, ranging from wicked uncle to ghostly intervention. And some of the more dramatic tales include whispers that the walls themselves conspired against the boys, closing doors behind them like sarcastic medieval toddlers. Guards were assigned, naturally, but guards in that era were either bribed, scared of a mysterious hooded figure, or busy eating the castle's pigeon rations, leaving the princes to fester in rumor-fueled isolation. Visitors reported catching glimpses of them playing chess or staring at tapestries, only for the boys to suddenly vanish while a wind rattled the iron bars. Later accounts suggest one prince was even seen on the staircase waving cheerfully before disappearing through a door no one else could find. Rumors spread like wildfire in London pubs. One suggested the boys had been spirited away by fairies, which, okay, sounds ridiculous, but at least it's way more fun than imagining a secret murder plot. Political types, naturally, preferred the darker explanations, with nobles quietly betting which relative would benefit most, effectively turning tragedy into an early version of reality TV, but with more swords and fewer sponsors. The tower itself, a moody jumble of turrets, passageways, and hidden staircases, may have contributed, because when your walls are thick enough to echo your own voice, for 10 minutes, every disappearing act feels plausible. Chroniclers noted that the prince's rooms were meticulously cleaned each day, yet no trace of the boys remained after their last known appearances. It was as if the castle chewed them up and spit out only the memory of their laughter. Scholars later tried mapping the tower's architecture to figure out escape routes, hidden alcoves, and secret dungeons, only to conclude that the place was a labyrinth designed by someone who clearly hated being found. Gossip mingled with genuine fear. Servants swore they heard childish laughter late at night, and sometimes tiny footsteps running along corridors that had no visible inhabitants, which some dismissed as hallucination fueled by candle smoke. Letters between the king's advisors carefully avoided mentioning the boy's absence, using terms like unavailable and engaged in private studies, which reads today as peak bureaucratic dodge, or the historical equivalent of ghosting. Decades later, the mystery of the princes in the tower became a staple cautionary tale about castles, politics, and how being small and royal is basically signing up to be invisible, or worse. Modern tourists walk the same halls, reading plaques about brave princes, unaware that every stone seems to hold a faint sense of vanished footsteps and unanswered questions. And so, the tower continued its reputation as the place where even tiny humans could disappear entirely, leaving nothing but whispered legends and frustrated historians who keep shaking their heads at the absurdity of missing children in one of England's most secure buildings. By the early 16th century, Glamis Castle in Scotland had earned a reputation for being equal parts grandiose residence and architectural troll. Noble families passing through often commented on its beauty, sprawling gardens, and oddly placed corridors that seemed designed to make visitors question their life choices. Among the legends was a secret room, said to be hidden so well that not even the laziest servant could accidentally stumble upon it, and somehow that room had a way of swallowing people whole. Accounts tell of a maid named Elspeth who, curious and slightly bored, noticed a door behind a tapestry depicting some heroic ancestor with suspiciously intense eyebrows. She tugged, pushed, and muttered curses in Scots until finally the door creaked open into utter darkness. She vanished for days, leaving only her broom and a faint scent of lavender behind. When eventually rescued, or so the stories claim, she could only mumble about corridors that looped endlessly, staircases leading back to the same dusty corner, and whispers that sounded like her own voice but with subtle threats. Nobility found this simultaneously terrifying and hilarious, because while the room was supposed to hide scandalous documents or smuggling routes, it had clearly been upgraded into a full-on human Bermuda Triangle. Local lore suggested that members of the family deliberately left confusing architecture, which is plausible because who wouldn't enjoy a good game of hide and seek where the stakes were possibly your sanity? Guests who tried mapping the place ended up creating fan theories more convoluted than the castle itself, hypothesizing secret tunnels connecting to the moat, underground dungeons, or even mysterious chambers beneath the chapel where no one dared tread. Courtiers swore the room occasionally blinked, like it wasn't meant to exist continuously, and anyone who got too close risked being enveloped by shadows or dizzying stair spirals that seemed to obey some unspoken geometric joke. Historians later speculated that chroniclers might have exaggerated, because yes, the family could be dramatic, but Glamis's floor plans still confuse modern architects, which is proof enough that someone definitely intended to mess with people. Even more absurdly, rumor had it that the castle staff would sometimes hide there voluntarily during particularly boring family dinners, effectively using the secret room as the medieval equivalent of a mental health day. The secret room became part of the cultural DNA. Storytellers, bards, and drunken soldiers recounted tales of Glamis swallowing the curious, the nosy, and the unlucky, which only increased the castle's eerie charm. Tourists today may stroll through sunlit halls, unaware that just behind a tapestry, the architecture still has that mischievous glint, ready to confuse anyone daring enough to peek. In short, Glamis Castle's hidden chamber wasn't just a space, it was an experience, a reminder that sometimes walls have opinions, corridors have moods, and certain rooms really don't care if you ever leave. It was the ultimate medieval prank, played on anyone curious or foolish, enough to explore without permission. And in that absurd, slightly terrifying way, the legend of the secret room persisted, blending history with human error, architectural hubris, and a little dash of supernatural flair. Off the rugged coast of Scotland, the island of Eilean Mor became infamous in the 19th century for swallowing entire lighthouse crews without so much as a farewell note. The lighthouse itself stood proud against crashing waves, seemingly innocuous, yet somehow every rotation of keepers ended with at least one missing, and sometimes all three. Official reports blamed storms, exhaustion, and the occasional man overboard, but local fishermen whispered of strange lights, phantom footsteps, and the occasional flicker of a figure appearing on the rocky cliffs, only to dissolve into mist. One particularly stubborn keeper, Hamish, was said to have argued with a visiting inspector that the building had moods, that the walls themselves whispered in Gaelic when no one was supposed to hear. His colleagues laughed at first, until Hamish disappeared mid-breakfast, leaving only a half-finished cup of tea and a note scribbled in trembling ink. The sea brought friends I cannot name. Subsequent crews arrived to clean, restock, and endure the isolation, but invariably the pattern repeated. Logs show entries like crew accounted for, and then a week later, crew missing, reasons unknown, which modern readers might interpret as horrifyingly negligent or medievally cursed, depending on your tolerance for absurdity. Some speculated that the lighthouse's foundations rested on shifting rock that occasionally swallowed doors and stairs, creating impossible gaps that led to vertical voids, basically a natural funhouse designed to eject humans. Others posited supernatural intervention, spirits of shipwrecked sailors seeking revenge, or the island itself being a sentient entity practicing selective recruitment. One day, a visiting journalist attempted to investigate, only to return paler than usual, claiming that at midnight he glimpsed his own reflection smiling at him from a window he was certain he'd locked, before vanishing entirely for 3 hours. When he reappeared, he refused to speak of it, citing things better left forgotten, which is historian code for it's creepy as hell. Over time, these vanishings became folklore, a mix of cautionary tale and horror story that scared off applicants, inspired songs, and gave local pubs endless material for dramatic storytelling. People began to consider Eilean Mor less a lighthouse and more a selective recruitment center for the living, or perhaps an experimental Bermuda Triangle designed by some unseen prankster with a penchant for irony. Letters between lighthouse authorities show a desperate attempt at rational explanations, citing weather reports, illness, and miscommunication. Yet the pattern never changed. The island continued to eat keepers with eerie consistency, leaving behind journals half-written, boots neatly placed, and a lingering scent of sea salt mixed with the faintest hint of fear. Even today, the story resonates as a testament to isolation, nature's power, and the utterly absurd notion that a perfectly reasonable job could result in sudden disappearance, leaving families, historians, and storytellers alike to fill the gaps with increasingly dramatic and slightly sarcastic imaginations. The legend of Eilean Mor persists, not because it was officially mysterious, but because some places are just too stubbornly creepy to ignore. In 17th century France, the mystery of the man in the iron mask was basically the world's first celebrity conspiracy theory, except instead of paparazzi, there were guards, ink-stained clerks, and a lot of dramatic sighing. The man appeared suddenly in the Bastille, face obscured by an iron mask, whose exact design was debated endlessly, because naturally no one could agree whether it was more goth chic or medieval torture aesthetic. Rumors swirled that he was royalty, a rebellious twin, or just an exceptionally unlucky courtier who had annoyed the wrong minister. The truth, like most good historical enigmas, remained somewhere between probably boring and utterly tragic. He was moved from prison to prison, sometimes in total silence, escorted by soldiers who probably whispered gossip to each other about the man's melodramatic stoicism, or whether his mask muffled snoring at night. Memoirs from the period described guards being unnerved by his stillness, his eyes that seemed to observe the soul directly, and the occasional muffled sigh or cough that echoed like a cryptic message, leaving them second-guessing their own sanity. One wily prisoner supposedly tried to communicate with him through paper notes, only to get a response so curt it could have been interpreted as either a royal edict or a passive-aggressive tweet, "Do not disturb." Historians still argue whether the mask was black velvet with iron reinforcement or full-on solid metal, which matters if you care about fashion history, but less so if you're fascinated by existential dread. Louis XIV, naturally, handled the situation with all the subtlety of a teenager deleting texts before their parents saw them, issuing vague instructions and insisting the man be treated humanely, which reads today like code for, "Please don't talk about him." The man in the iron mask became more than a prisoner. He became a symbol of secrecy, power, and absurd bureaucracy. Artists, writers, and bored aristocrats speculated endlessly, turning every missing detail into a mini-drama, complete with imagined dialogues, tragic hero monologues, and plot twists that no one could verify. Even today, when people tour the Bastille ruins or read romanticized novels, they can almost hear the muffled voice behind the iron, hinting at knowledge that no one alive could ever confirm. Some theories are so elaborate that they involve doubles, hidden passageways, and coded messages in God's rations, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that human creativity peaks when faced with impenetrable mystery. The man's very existence teased the idea that being trapped, visibly yet invisibly, was a form of performance, and that disappearance didn't always mean vanishing physically. Sometimes it meant being erased socially, historically, and metaphorically. The sheer absurdity of a man being permanently masked, escorted through corridors, and never officially explained makes one wonder if the entire French court collectively decided to ghost him, which, in the grand scheme of power politics, might have been the most efficient option. In the end, the man in the iron mask remains both a historical headache and a legend, embodying human fascination with secrecy, identity, and the ironic tendency of powerful people to complicate matters just because they could. Leap Castle in Ireland, late 16th century, was already infamous for its general willingness to host chaos, but the Bloody Chapel took things to a whole new level, because apparently medieval architects and murder enthusiasts sometimes collaborated. The chapel itself was a small, dimly lit room with high windows that barely let in sunlight, pews that squeaked under the weight of secrets, and an altar that seemed permanently stained, rumor had it, with something far more interesting than spilled wine. Visitors reported a persistent chill and the occasional metallic scent, which could either be historical evidence or a medieval version of someone forgot to take out the trash for decades. Stories tell of priests, servants, and occasionally unsuspecting guests disappearing within the chapel's stone walls, sometimes leaving behind a shoe, sometimes nothing at all, like the building itself had a preferential sense of humor. Some brave, or stupid, explorers claimed they heard whispers urging them to kneel, confess, or run very fast, and upon turning a corner, they'd find a hidden door swinging gently, as if inviting someone new to participate in its ongoing tradition of vanishing. Historical accounts are dramatic. One nobleman apparently went in to inspect the chapel for repairs, emerged pale and screaming hours later, and refused to speak, citing things that do not wish to be named, which is the medieval equivalent of TikTok horror challenge clickbait. Modern historians speculate about secret dungeons, underground oubliettes, or even just convenient holes in the floor, but the locals maintain the legend with gleeful exaggeration, claiming that the chapel chooses its victims based on subtle facial expressions or the scent of new shoes. The blood that stained the altar reportedly inspired the castle's name for centuries, though some skeptics point to its poetic flair and regular humidity issues as possible culprits. Leap Castle's corridors were labyrinthine, full of hidden rooms and staircases that changed perception based on candlelight and fatigue, so it's entirely plausible that someone could wander in and never find their way out, effectively letting the castle eat them socially, physically, and existentially. Tales from servants suggest that at night, shadows moved independently, murmurs floated without source, and occasionally a cold hand brushed the back of the neck of anyone daring enough to linger, making it clear that the bloody chapel was not a place for polite conversation or interior design critiques. Over time, these disappearances became a form of storytelling and local pride, like we have the most haunted chapel in Europe, except with actual unsettling evidence. Tourists today get guided tours, but even the guides sometimes report strange feelings or a misplaced footstep that no one remembers taking, reinforcing the idea that Leap Castle doesn't just house people, it tests them. In the end, the bloody chapel embodies the absurd charm of a place that simultaneously worshipped God, scared the living daylights out of humans, and perfected the art of making rooms so mysterious that disappearing inside them seemed perfectly reasonable. It's a reminder that sometimes history isn't just dramatic, it's actively hungry. By the late 19th century, Bran Castle in Transylvania had cultivated an image equal parts tourist attraction and sinister legend, mostly thanks to its vaulted corridors, hidden chambers, and a history that seemed allergic to normalcy. Local accounts tell of prisoners, sometimes political, sometimes criminal, and occasionally just unlucky travelers, who were briefly confined in the castle's smaller cells and then inexplicably vanished overnight, leaving guards pacing nervously, questioning their eyesight, and maybe their life choices. One notable story involves a young man named Ion, arrested for minor tax evasion, who was placed in a damp cell with a single candle. By morning, his chains were neatly coiled on the floor, and he had disappeared entirely, leaving a faint trace of tobacco smoke in the air and a single, inexplicable scratch on the wall, as if he'd left a secret autograph. Guards and servants whispered about the castle itself, speaking after midnight, soft voices carrying through stone corridors that should have been silent, repeating the names of missing people, or sometimes uttering cryptic warnings in a language no one alive seemed to fully understand. Aristocrats found it simultaneously terrifying and amusing, like having a house with a passive-aggressive roommate who occasionally rearranged furniture and hoarded the silverware. Visitors claimed to feel sudden chills, hear footsteps echoing in empty halls, and glimpse shadows retreating just as they tried to investigate, which became the standard atmospheric effect for Bran Castle tours, long before Instagram made spooky aesthetic trendy. Some stories suggested that certain rooms were enchanted or trapped, a combination of old superstition, clever architecture, and the kind of neglect that turns ordinary masonry into a mischievous accomplice. Letters exchanged between regional officials hint at quiet concern, carefully phrased to avoid mentioning disappearances directly. Phrases like temporary reassignment and extended absence became coded language for, "We have no idea where this person went. Please don't ask." Scholars visiting the castle in later decades tried mapping its floors, noting secret stairways, false doors, and corridors that defied conventional logic, leading to theories that the castle itself had some spatial mischief embedded in its foundations. Rumors persist of midnight apparitions, faint murmurs, and the sensation of unseen eyes tracking one's every step, which most historians would dismiss as folklore, except for the meticulously recorded accounts of guards who had vanished or returned days later with vague, disturbed expressions. Bran Castle, like many of its contemporaries, illustrates that disappearance in historical contexts was not always dramatic or violent. Sometimes it was architectural, psychological, or just the result of walls that refused to play fair. The stories of vanished prisoners became part of the cultural imagination, blending fear, dark humor, and the absurd reality of humans trying and failing to fully dominate a space that was always a little too clever for its inhabitants. Even today, the castle stands as a monument to mystery, a place where history and legend mingle, and where the whispers of past prisoners remind visitors that disappearing is sometimes just a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong midnight hour. In the annals of Europe's weirder architectural choices, there exists a castle so thoroughly confusing that it became known locally as the one that ate people, which is both terrifying and marketing genius if you think about it. Built in the early 1600s on a rocky cliff with precipitous drops on all sides, this castle was a tangle of hallways, staircases, hidden trapdoors, and windows that led to thin air, making every visit feel like a medieval escape room designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor. Guests reported wandering endlessly, hearing their own voices echo back in ways that made it sound like multiple people were arguing, only to find every room rearranged, or perhaps they had imagined it, because memory, fear, and exhaustion blend hilariously when the walls are sentient enough to mess with you. Servants and soldiers alike vanished frequently, sometimes for hours, sometimes for weeks. When they returned, they spoke vaguely of rooms that moved and doors that ate their hands, which is either extremely literal or extremely metaphorical, depending on your tolerance for architectural absurdity. The castle's lord, apparently unbothered by the frequent disappearances, insisted it was a feature, not a bug, and encouraged guests to explore freely, as though willingly entering a space that might swallow you whole was a selling point for hospitality. Historians later described the layout as labyrinthine beyond reason, a kind of practical joke perpetrated across centuries, with spiral staircases that ended in ceilings, corridors looping back on themselves, and hidden alcoves that seemed to appear only when one wasn't looking. Some locals swore the castle had a mind of its own, that it selected who would vanish based on curiosity, clumsiness, or sheer arrogance, which, if true, makes it the earliest known conscious AI before electricity was even a concept. Tales circulated of noblemen sent to inspect the kitchens or wine cellars who disappeared entirely, only for their boots or hats to resurface in unlikely spots weeks later, as if the building were saying, "I keep the essentials." Even more absurdly, letters sent to distant relatives attempted polite explanations. Your son is occupied with architectural studies or currently exploring new chambers, leaving families either exasperated or suspiciously relieved that polite phrasing masked the literal truth. Over time, the castle's eating habit became legend, inspiring stories, songs, and occasional late-night dares, cementing its reputation as both terrifying and irresistibly fascinating. Visitors claim to sense presences, hear doors creak without wind, and occasionally glimpse figures disappearing around corners that didn't seem to exist, which only added to the human tendency to blame the building for one's own navigational failures. Ultimately, the castle that ate people stands as a monument to the absurdity of human ambition, architectural creativity, and our eternal fascination with places that refuse to behave, proving that sometimes the most lasting legends are born not from war or politics, but from stairs, walls, and doors that simply refuse to let you go. And so, across centuries, the castle kept swallowing, teasing, and humbling anyone bold enough to enter, a reminder that not all disappearances are sinister. Some are just architectural,